Good morning to the Sapp Church Sunday School family. We're glad to be able to come to you again today. And I trust that our lesson will be a blessing to you today. It's coming from the book of Daniel, chapter 8. And the title of the lesson is Vision of the Ram and the Goat. May sound like a strange title, but this represents two kingdoms that's going to come. And we want to mention some things as sort of a background for this lesson. As you will recall, Daniel was carried into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar's people in about 605 BC. And it is believed that at the time he was carried, he was a teenager, possibly 15, 16 years old. When we read through Daniel then and we get to the end of chapter 5, that was at the end of the Babylonian Empire. This was about 539 BC. And if Daniel was 15 when he was carried into captivity in 605, at the time that the Medo-Persian Empire overthrew the Babylonian Empire and took power, Daniel would have been about 81 years old. And I wanted to say this about the book of Daniel. The first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel are written in chronological order. In other words, they go in sequence as far as history is concerned. And then, so it starts in 605 when Daniel was carried, and of course you remember this first chapter there deals with the fact that Daniel chose his own diet and was allowed to use his own diet. And then in 539, the Medo-Persian Empire, Darius the Mede, overthrew Belshazzar, and they took over the kingdom at that time. And the second part of the book of Daniel, though, starting at chapter 7 and going through the rest of the book, chapter 12, they're not in chronological order. They're in topical order, and there's a reason for that. Through chapters 7 through 12 deal with a common topic or a common theme, and of course that is the visions and the dreams and the prophecies of Daniel. And basically what you're going to find is that at the end of chapter 5, the Babylonian Empire is overthrown by the Persian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire. This was in 539. And Darius the Mede was made king over the province of Babylon, the territory that was formerly held by the Babylonian Empire. And basically Cyrus made Darius the Mede a sub-king under himself and made him the king in the portion of the kingdom that they overtook as far as Babylon was concerned. In other words, Cyrus did not want to move his capital from Shushan the palace, which was in Persia, to Babylon. So he made Darius, however you pronounce his name, king in the territory formerly held by the Babylonians. And then in chapter 6, when we get to chapter 6 in the book of Daniel, we find that this is the chapter where Daniel is thrown into the den of lions. And this was during the time of Belshazzar's reign, who was a Babylonian, the last of the Babylonian kings. And the reason I wanted to point this out is so many times when we look at Bible stories and things of that nature that tells about the story of Daniel in the lion's den, we often think that Daniel was a teenager or a very young adult when this happened. By today's terms, Daniel would have been an old man. He would have probably been around 82 years old at the time as a minimum. So I just wanted to throw that in. That's just a little bit of Bible trivia, I guess. But anyway, this happened about 539 or 538 BC, about close to a year after that Darius the Mede took over the Babylonian kingdom. Now then, when we get to chapter 7, as we said, chapter 7 through 12 deal with Daniel's end-time dreams, visions, and prophecies. And what we want to see is Daniel actually started having his dreams and visions from which his prophecies came from in the days of the Babylonian Empire. As a matter of fact, if you look at chapter 7, it says it was in the first year of Belshazzar, who was the last Babylonian king. and that would have been in about 553 BC. Well, in chapter 8, where we'll be studying from today, this was in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. And that would have been probably 551 or 550 BC. Daniel would have been about 67 when he had his first dream in chapter 7. And he would have been 2 or 3 years older than that whenever chapter 8 comes around. So he would have been 69 or 70 years old there around at the time of our lesson today. Now, looking at the book in chronological or historical order, if we want to say it that way, the book would look like this. You'd have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. Then you'd go to chapter 7, chapter 8, and then back up and get chapter 5, chapter 6, and then chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12 in that order. And that would put it in chronological order as far as the time frames of the book is concerned. But the reason chapters 7 through 12, well, let me put it like this. Chapters 1 through 6 are composed of stories, and you recognize those stories very well. Of course, the first chapter dealt with Daniel refusing to eat the king's meat and had his own diet. He was allowed to have his own diet, him and his 3 friends. And then as you go through chapters 1 through 6, you'll see the story of the 3 Hebrew children that was thrown in the fiery furnace. Then in chapter 6, you'll see where Daniel was cast into the den of lions. And but once you get to chapter 7, it's a different topic then. It deals strictly with prophecies concerning future events that was to take place. And chapters 7 through 12 are called apocalyptic literature. Just like the book of Revelation in the New Testament is referred to as apocalyptic literature. And the word apocalyptic there is derived from the Greek word apocalypta. And that word means to uncover, to disclose, or to reveal. And apocalyptic writings employ a lot of symbolic language to tell of events that are to happen at some future time, and they happen by divine intervention. That's what makes it apocalyptic. It's God controlling things and making things come to pass just like they are. And so God works in His divine providence and His divine sovereignty. He works through men, he guides events, He works through men and through kingdoms to bring about His purpose. And we'll see that happening as we go through this lesson today. Now, I would like to think a little bit about the visions and the dreams of the book of Daniel. And since the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2 relates very much to the dreams and visions that Daniel had starting in chapter 7, I wanted to include some of chapter 2 in with chapter 7 that we would have studied last week had we have had Sunday school. And then this week in chapter 8, I want to look at those 3 chapters in particular and talk about how that Daniel described the kingdoms that was going to come into this world. And he lived to see 2 of them. He lived during the time of the Babylonian kingdom, and I also lived in the beginnings of the Medo-Persian Empire. So I wanted to look at some things. Now in chapters 2 and chapter 7 and in chapter 8 here, Daniel identified some kingdoms. And like I said, there's a lot of symbolic language that he used here to describe these kingdoms. In chapter 2 and chapter 7, well, let's just start with chapter 2. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He had a dream of an image. And that image was in the likeness of a statue of a man. And it was a metallic image. It was made up of all different kinds of metals, except for the feet and the toes. And the feet and the toes were made of partly of a metal and partly of clay. Then in chapter 7, Daniel saw 3 kingdoms arise, and basically he described them using creatures from the animal world. The 4th creature, he had never seen an animal that looked like that creature, so he just described him as a creature that was terrible and dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, And he went on to say that it had iron teeth. And then in chapter 8, he only describes two kingdoms there. That's the second and the third kingdom that arose. That's the Medo-Persian and the Grecian Empire that he describes in chapter 8. And I wanted to look at chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8 and use the terminology that Daniel used in his writing of these kingdoms. The first kingdom, of course, was Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire. And in chapter 2 in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the Babylonian Empire is represented by the head of gold on the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw. In chapter 7, Daniel's looking at the first kingdom, he described him as a lion that had eagle's wings. And then in chapter 8, the first kingdom, Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, is not discussed at all. In the second kingdom was the Medo-Persian Empire. And in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the Medo-Persian Empire was represented by breast and arms of silver in that statue, in that image. In chapter 7, Daniel identified the beast as a leopard, as a bear that was raised up on one side. And then in chapter 8, Daniel, in his vision, saw the second kingdom as a bear that had as a ram that had two horns, And then the third empire was the Grecian Empire. And in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and in the image that he saw, the Grecian Empire was represented by the belly and thighs of brass. In Daniel's dream of chapter 7, the third kingdom, the Grecian Empire, was represented by a leopard that had 4 wings and 4 heads. And then in chapter 8, the third kingdom, the Grecian Empire, was represented by a he-goat that had a notable horn between his eyes. And then the fourth kingdom, of course, we come to know as the Roman Empire. And in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and in the image that he saw, the Roman Empire was represented by the legs of iron and the feet and toes, part of iron and part of clay. In Daniel's dream in chapter 7, the Roman Empire was represented not by any particular animal that Daniel had ever seen before, but he referred to him as a beast, and he said he was dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly, with iron teeth, and had 10 horns. And then in chapter 8, the fourth empire is not addressed again. So we can see from all of these representations here that there is a lot of symbology in the book of Daniel. And of course, in looking at these kingdoms, some things that we come, and the Bible, Daniel himself in his writings, he identifies all of these kingdoms except the Roman Empire. We'll talk about that a little later as we get into the lesson. But as we look at these kingdoms that came about throughout history of the world, we can see that some of Daniel's prophecies have been fulfilled throughout history since the time of his dreams and visions. And then that there will still be a future fulfillment of some of his prophecies. And that will take place when Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom in this world. And we'll talk more about that as we go through this lesson today. But today we want to start reading in Daniel chapter 8. That's where our lesson comes from today. And we want to start reading in the first 2 verses there, and we want to look at some things here. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1 and 2 says this: In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw, that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Now, basically in these 2 verses, we find out when the vision took place. It took place in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. That's what verse 1 tells us, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. And then it tells us in the next verse, in verse 2, where he was transported in his vision. Whether he was there physically or not, I don't know, but at least in his vision, he was in Shushan the palace. And you might say, well, wonder why that he went there. Well, let me tell you this. Shushan was the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire, especially the Persian side of the Medo-Persian Empire. This is where Cyrus had made his capital, and he didn't want to leave Shushan. So I guess it's appropriate that Daniel's vision, and talking about the second empire that was to come, and at the time he gave this, had this vision and was given this interpretation, the Medo-Persian Empire had not arisen. So this was yet in the future to the time Daniel had this vision. And so he was transported, I think, in a vision to Shushan the palace. And that is appropriate because, as I said, that was the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now then, also I wanted to point this out about chapter 8. As you look at the Medo-Persian Empire, Daniel only gives like 2 verses in talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. Very little he says about them. The rest of the chapter deals with the Grecian Empire. And why is that? Well, chapter 8, well, the last verse in chapter 7 actually talks about the demise of the Babylonian Empire and the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. Well, in chapter 8, in the first 4 verses or so there, what we're going to see is we see the demise of the Medo-Persian Empire and the rise of the Grecian Empire. So that's the reason he spends very little time dealing with the Medo-Persian Empire. So in chapter 8, verse 3 and 4, we want to go there now and read. It says, "Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great." Now, notice that Daniel in this vision saw a ram with 2 horns. And there was something about these horns that particularly caught his attention. He noticed that one of the horns was higher than the other. And it says that that horn came up last. What that tells me is that Daniel evidently saw these horns as they began to grow on this ram. And one came up and then another one started growing up after it, but it continued to grow until it was higher than the first horn that he saw. And as we've already stated, this ram with the 2 horns represented the Medo-Persian Empire. Now you ask me, how do I know that? Well, you know, it's best to let the Bible tell you or interpret its own symbolism when it will. And in this case it does. If you'll look down with me to verse 20, what you'll see is the ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. So the Bible tells us this was the ram represented the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Now, Persia, going back to the horns now, it says one horn was higher than the other. Well, that's because Persia was the predominant or the most dominant of the 2 kingdoms of this 2-nation or 2-kingdom merger that formed the Medo-Persian Empire. Cyrus was the, I guess you might say, the great king, and Darius or Darius, however you pronounce his name, the Median, was under Cyrus, and he made Darius the Mede a sub-king under him to rule over the territory that had been formerly held by the Babylonians, because, like I said, Cyrus didn't want to move his capital from Shushan to Babylon. Now then, we learn from verse 4 that Cyrus was a great, powerful king. It says that there was none that could deliver out of his hand, but they did according to his will and became great. So he became a great king. He conquered much territory, including the land of Babylon. Then as we go into verse 5, I wanted us to notice this about what was taking place here. Daniel was trying to concentrate on the ram that he was seeing. But all of a sudden, there was something else that came across his vision there. And this was an image or a vision of a goat. And let's read about that. It says, and as I was considering, and he was considering the ram at that time, and as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great. When he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And I'll stop right there, and we'll go back up to verse 5 and talk about that. Daniel in this vision saw this he-goat coming from the west, and it says here that he was moving so fast, he was coming so fast that he didn't even touch the ground. It was just like he was kind of floating on the air or flying as he come across there. And then the Bible says that this he-goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And I looked up the word notable there, and that word notable means having a striking appearance. It was very prominent. It would get your attention. And so Daniel gave special attention to this horn. And when it came to the ram there, now our lesson says that the ram attacked the goat, but it sounds to me like from reading these verses that the goat attacked the ram. But anyway, there was battle between the Medo-Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire. And basically what happened was the Grecian Empire overcome the Medo-Persian Empire. Took down both the kings, the king of Median and the king of Persia. And took over their empire, and over time added a lot of land territory to it. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But you say, now how did you know this was the Grecian Empire? Well, again, the Bible tells us in verse 21 down here, it tells us, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now we know that the king who was in power at the time that they overthrew the Medo-Persian Empire was Alexander the Great. He was called Alexander the Great. And I want to give us just a little bit of history here about this. A man by the name of Philip II was the king of Macedonia, or what we know today as Greece at that time. But in 336 he was assassinated. And at that time his 20-year-old son, Alexander, took the throne. And he became known as Alexander the Great because of his exploits. In chapter 7, I wanted to go back to chapter 7 and talk about the third kingdom a little bit. You remember in Daniel's dream in chapter 7, he identified this third kingdom, or the Grecian Empire, by a leopard that had 4 wings and 4 heads. And in chapter 8 he's talked about as a he-goat. Well, I wanted to think about the 4 wings and the 4 heads just a minute. The 4 wings talks about the fact that he conquered everything in his path very quickly. He was evidently a mighty statistician, or whatever you call it. He had a lot of military genius. And just as it was said about Cyrus, nothing could stand before him. Evidently nothing could stand in the way of Alexander the Great, because he conquered much territory. And then I'll talk about the 4 heads in just a minute. But what I wanted to point out here is in less than 13 years, Alexander the Great had established a very great and a large empire, exceeding the empires of any kingdom that had come before him. More than the Babylonians, more than the Medo-Persians. He basically had conquered the known world at that time. So after a reign in 323 BC, after a reign of 12 years and 8 months, he died of a fever. And of course, then that comes to the 4 heads on the leopard in chapter 7, and to the 4 horns that came up after the notable horn between the goat's eyes was broken. And that is, this represents 4 men who took over and split up the kingdom of the Grecian Empire, and took over as leaders of these 4 kingdoms. And I'm going to name those to you in just a minute. The 4 horns represents these 4 generals that served under Alexander the Great. And they split the kingdom up into 4 different states or kingdoms after the death of Alexander. Now, these 4 generals, one of them was named Seleucus. who took over Syria and much of the Middle East, and probably includes a lot of the land of Israel as we know it today. And then, and his empire became known as the Seleucid Empire. And then there was a man by the name of Ptolemy, and he took over Egypt. He was the second general. Then another general by the name of Cassander, he took over Greece. And then another one by the name of Lysimachus, he took over Turkey. And I'll guarantee you I pronounced every one of those words right, so you don't have to worry about it. But anyway, as I said earlier, you'll notice that chapter 8 from this point on deals strictly, or mostly, I'll say it that way, with the third kingdom, the Grecian Empire. But I wanted to take just a minute before we go into the history of this third empire, and I wanted to talk about how God used the Medo-Persian Empire as well as the Grecian Empire to accomplish his purpose for his people, the children of Israel. As a matter of fact, Cyrus, the great king of the Medo-Persian Empire, he played a great role in the history of the children of Israel. And I want to say this about it. God is in control. Even before Cyrus was born, Isaiah the prophet talked about this man, called him by name. And notice what he said in Isaiah 44 and 28. He said, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Now why is that so important? Why is that important? Well, let's just say it like this. It was in the first year of the reign of Cyrus, the Medo-Persian Empire, that he gave the children of Israel, the children of Judah that had been taken captive, he gave them permission, all that wanted to go back to Jerusalem and build the house of God again. So God used this man. And of course, this took place after the 70 years of captivity was over. Now you can read more about Cyrus's place in the first chapter of the book of Ezra. Ezra is the book that talks about them going back to Jerusalem and beginning the restoration of the building of the temple and so on. So you can read about that in the book of Ezra. And then we want to ask the same question about Alexander the Great. How did Alexander the Great, how did God use this man to accomplish his purpose? Well, when Alexander the Great ruled the world after he had conquered the Medo-Persians and then added much territory to his kingdom, he made some changes throughout his kingdom that probably didn't sit well with a lot of the folks that he had conquered. And one of those things that he required was that all people under his rule learn to speak the Greek language. Now, and over time, the Greek language became the common language of the whole Mediterranean world. And you might say, well, why is that important? Well, think about it like this. Jesus came into this world. He gave his life on the cross of Calvary to save mankind. And before he ascended back to heaven, he gave the church this great commission. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Now, what I'm trying to say is, wherever they went to preach the gospel, there was not a language barrier. See, all the people in that, they could speak the Greek language. A lot of them could speak their own native tongue, but they also spoke the Greek language as a requirement of the government. So, when the apostles, and especially the Apostle Paul, whenever he traveled throughout the known world at that time, he didn't have to have an interpreter. Everybody could understand him when he spoke in the Greek language. Not only that, but when the early apostles and the New Testament writers, whenever they penned the words of what we know today as the New Testament, they wrote it in the Greek language. So you see, God used this man. He didn't know what he was doing probably, but he was under the control of God. God was in control. He was making Alexander the Great and the generals under him that took over these kingdoms, he instilled that in their spirit, their heart as well, and they caused all the people to learn the Greek language, which was a great blessing when it comes to the spread of the gospel in the early church. Now, let me say this. God is in control. We may not recognize it every time. Just as Cyrus probably didn't realize that he was just a pawn in God's hand in sending the children of Israel back to Israel. Alexander the Great probably didn't know he was just a pawn in the hand of God whenever God used him to start everybody speaking the Greek language. But God is in control. He knows every situation, and He knows how to orchestrate events, and He knows how to orchestrate men to accomplish His purpose, and that's exactly what He did here. Then in verses 9 through 14, let's read these right quick. Now, verse 8, I think I'll read verse 8 with this as well, because it says right here, in verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, or he died. That was Alexander the Great's death. And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them, out of one of these land territories that was taken over by the 4 generals of Alexander the Great, out of one of their land territories there come forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spoke, how long shall the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under feet? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, as we said there, the Alexander the Great's empire, the Grecian Empire, was split into 4 different kingdoms, headed by the 4 generals that served under Alexander the Great. In verse 9, we read that out of one of those kingdoms, another horn would arise, and which would be evidently another country, or basically he would take over that 4th kingdom, or that kingdom that he rose up out of, basically is the way I interpreted it anyway. And it says, in the days of that king, he would become great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And from history we learned that was from the Seleucid Empire, the general Seleucus that was served under Alexander, the kingdom that he started, or he took over after Alexander died. This little horn came up in that particular part of his kingdom. And it became known, as I said, as the Seleucid Empire. And I think it would be good at this point, since we get into this terminology, little horn, and all of these things, I wanted to point out that there's different views as to who this little horn represents, or who he was or is. And some believe that this little horn in Daniel chapter 8 was a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And I may not be saying that word right either, but anyway, he came to power in the latter days of the Greek Seleucid Empire. And you can read about that in verse 33. It says, in the latter days of that kingdom, this man would rise. And then we'll talk more about this man a little later in the lesson. But let's go on and talk about what other interpretations of this little horn is. Others believe that this little horn in chapter 8 refers completely to the future Antichrist that will arise just before Christ's second advent. Others believe that Old Testament prophecies can sometimes have a short-term fulfillment and then a long-term fulfillment. And based on their belief, then this prophecy in chapter 8 can refer both to Antiochus and also to the future Antichrist. My particular belief is that that is the correct interpretation. I'm not saying it is, that's just my belief. I sort of tend to hold with that line of thought. And here's the reason I do. In verse 13, one of the verses that we just read there, you'll see the term transgression of desolation. Well, in the latter part of the book of Daniel, in chapter 9 verse 27, chapter 11 verse 31, and chapter 12 verse 11, you'll see that this term is the abomination that maketh desolate. And then when you get to the New Testament, you'll see in Matthew 24:15 and in Mark 13 and 14, it's referred to as the abomination of desolation. And then in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20, it's just referred to as the desolation. And it's clear as you read the New Testament references that the person intended, or the direction that is pointing, is to the future Antichrist that would be yet to rise. And of course, that's easy to see from looking at it from the New Testament, because it's looking forward. Well, there's nothing that says, though, in chapter 8, that it could not refer to both Antiochus Epiphanes as well as the future Antichrist. The abomination of desolation, now that's where they desecrated the temple, where the temple was desecrated. Well, let's just look at a little history here now. It was first desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes. And this was repeated in AD 70 when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, burnt the temple with fire. So they desecrated it as well. And then of course we know that it will also be desecrated by the future Antichrist when he comes to power just before the second advent of Christ. And so there were short-term fulfillments by Antiochus and also by the Romans. And that future fulfillment then will be by the Antichrist himself during the second half of the tribulation period. But anyway, I wanted us to look at verse 10. There's some other interesting things about here that sometimes throws us for a loop when we try to look at Bible prophecy. In verse 10, says, and it waxed great even to the host of heaven. Now when we think of the host of heaven, we either think of the sun, moon, and stars, or the heavenly bodies, or else we think of angels, or God's armies, you know, whatever else. But here, many scholars believe that this refers to the people who serve God, the people who was faithful to offer the sacrifices in the temple and wanted to follow through with the ways that they had been taught through the law of Moses, you know, to worship God. And it says here that it cast down some of them, which means that many of them were murdered because they would not give up that practice when Antiochus Epiphanes came to power. It says, and it cast some of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. Now, who did the prince of the host talk about here? The prince of the host basically was referred probably to Onias, the high priest at that time. And when it says he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. In other words, what it's telling us here is that Antiochus halted all daily sacrifices that took place in the temple, and that the temple was rifled, it was robbed, and it was left desolate. And in verse 12, it says there in verse 12, and an host was given him against the daily sacrifice. When it says and a host was given him, that means that they were given into his hand. He just took over them. And because they wanted to continue with their sacrifices, they wanted to continue in obedience to the Jewish law, but he would not have that. And a host was given into his hand. Basically it means they were executed. He said, in the daily sacrifice, by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground. Now when it talked about it cast down the truth to the ground, it is told that Antiochus Epiphanes took the word of God that was in the temple there, cut it into pieces and burned it with fire. In other words, he would not allow the truth of God's word to be taught. And let me say this. If we think what he did was bad, what he did won't even hold a candle to what's going to take place during the days of the future Antichrist. Now, Antiochus himself was a type of the future Antichrist. And what he did won't even hold a light to it. But I want to read you some more things here now. In verse 13, the question is asked, how long? You know, and if I find it, I'll read it. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. How long is this going to be allowed to go on? Well, in verse 14, the answer came. And I want to quote something from your Sunday school commentary concerning this. And this is what it says. In December of 171 BC, Antiochus sent forces against the Jewish people, conquering Jerusalem. Because he desired religious and cultural uniformity for his domain, he set up pagan Greek worship practices in the temple in Jerusalem in 167 BC and went so far as to sacrifice swine on the temple altar. Many see this as the culminating event in what Daniel refers to as the transgression of desolation in verse 13. That is, it is the rebellion that brings about the desecration of the temple. Now, Antiochus' success is attributed to another thing here, and that is that some of the Jewish people, not all of them, but some of the Jewish people, they turned away from following God and began to follow after Hellenistic practices and beliefs, thus helping to bring about this abomination that is talked about in verse 13 there. The oppression and religious persecution would last until the Seleucids were defeated in the Maccabean Revolt, a series of battles that lasted several years, beginning in 167. The temple was rededicated in 165, and so the 2300 evenings and mornings or days is a round number that corresponds to the time between 171 BC, when the taking of Jerusalem, including the murder of the high priest, and the cleansing of the temple in 165, or just over 6 years. That kind of gives us an explanation of that there. Now, I wanted to look at verse 15 and 16 right quick. And it came to pass that Daniel, had seen the vision and sought the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So you can imagine Daniel there at his desire to know what he had just seen. Now, we have just read about the vision he saw. And he still wanted to know the meaning. And you can imagine the consternation that he was experiencing there as a result of that. But while he was standing there thinking on these things, he saw what appeared to be a man standing by. And he heard a voice speak and tell what he, I guess, thought was a man, spoke to this person and told him to tell Daniel the meaning of the vision he had seen. Well, let me say this. We know that it was Gabriel that he spoke to. It names him, and he is supposedly one of the chief of God's angels. Who but God can speak to an angel? Who but God can command an angel? So it was the voice that Daniel heard was no doubt the voice of God. Don't say that here, but I kind of want to think it was the voice of God that he heard. Is there a lesson in that for us? I think there is. I want you to know that God can speak. It don't matter what kind of time we get into, what goes on in this world, God can still speak. And you know, here he used an angel. But I remember in one place in Numbers chapter 22 where God used a mule, an ass, a donkey, to speak to the man Balaam. What I'm trying to say is God does speak. Us sometimes, we just don't recognize the voice of God sometimes when he speaks. Now, God is not limited in what means he can speak to us, but he does speak, and we need to learn to listen, don't we? Then verses 17 through 19. So he came near where I stood, this is Gabriel, and when he came, I was afraid, and fell upon my face. And he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. For at the time appointed, the end shall be. Now, Daniel probably didn't respond any differently than any of us would have responded if we came in the presence of an angel. He became very weak, almost in an unconscious type state there. He called a deep sleep here. But the angel Gabriel touched him and gave him strength to be able to set up and then hear the interpretation of the vision that he had just had. And then notice the terms it used here. We see the terms at the time of the end, and the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. And most of the time when we see these phrases or think about these phrases, we often automatically just go to the end of time, you know, at the time of Jesus' second advent. But again, I want us to think that there's probably a dual fulfillment here. You know, Antiochus Epiphanes, he had an end. And that's one thing we want to talk about here. As we look at the next few verses, we're going to see that this vision that Daniel had a specific application to these two kingdoms that we've just been talking about, the Medo-Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire, and the four kingdoms that came out of it. And starting in verse 20, and I've read verse 20 and 21, but I want to read them again. The ram which thou sawest, having two horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Because he was dead, Alexander the Great was dead. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressions are come to, let me say in verse 23, and in the latter time of their kingdom, the kingdoms of these four generals, and the latter that time of their kingdom, when the transgressions are come to a full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty. Well, let me just stop at verse 23 to start with. Gabriel told Daniel here in interpreting this vision for him that after Alexander the Great there would four generals stand up, or four kingdoms that would stand up, these four horns that came up in the place of the horn of Alexander the Great. And he said in the latter time of their kingdom, or in the last days of these four kingdoms, that rose up out of the Grecian Empire, a little horn will rise up, and we learn from history that near the end of the Greek, I guess you could say the Greek period, Antiochus rose to power. And he has been described by many as an evil genius. He was ruthless, malicious, spiteful. He showed pity to no man. And then when we get into verse 24 and 27, we're going to learn more about him and his activities. And starting in verse 24, it says, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore, shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted, and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Now, we understand from these verses that this man, Antiochus, became very powerful. But his power was not his own, and of course that's because that, and this is you might think it's a little strange for me to make this statement, but we sometimes don't like to think that God gives power to ungodly people, to heathen people. But I'm going to tell you, God can use anybody. I done mentioned the fact that he used a mule one time to speak to a man. Well, think about the nation of Israel. God used heathen people in the days of the judges to discipline his children. The nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, God used the heathen nation of Assyria to carry them into captivity. The southern kingdom of Judah, because of their sins, God used the heathen nation of the Babylonian Empire to carry them into captivity to discipline his children. So God can use anybody. Don't matter whether they're good people or bad people, God can use them. And so God allowed, let me put it that way, God allowed Antiochus to decimate his people. He brought great discipline to the nation of Judah. And it is said that some of the things that Antiochus did that we haven't mentioned earlier. It said that he made Jewish religious practices such as circumcision, Sabbath observance, and the celebration of Jewish feasts to be death penalty offenses. And so many people, many men, women, and children were put to death during his reign. It is said that in 168 BC alone, he had 80,000 Jewish people killed. So you can see how ruthless and how vicious this man was. But in verse 25, it says that he shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Now, some people look at this strictly talking about the future Antichrist standing up against Jesus and his armies. But let me say this. Whenever you mess with God's children, you're messing with God. And I want to read two verses of Scripture to you. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 says this, "And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curses thee." Then look at Matthew 25:40. "And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it to me." When Antiochus Epiphanes messed with God's people, he messed with God. And the Bible says he was taken out without hand. In other words, God didn't have to use an army to take this man out. It is said that Antiochus died insane in Persia in 163 BC. So God can take care of people that messes with his children. And basically, I want to point this out. This vision and the interpretation that we just talked about allows for a future fulfillment as well. We talked about the short-term fulfillments through Antiochus Epiphanes. But there's coming a future day that this is going to have a long-term fulfillment. And as I said, we're talking about the Antichrist that's going to come just before Christ's second advent to this world. And basically, I wanted to say this about it. Antiochus Epiphanes, his hostility, his reign would just fade in comparison to that of the future Antichrist. The Bible says in Matthew chapter 24, when that Antichrist arises, there's never been a day of persecution and suffering like there will be in that day. And it says it'll never be that bad again. So you can tell from that what we've read about today concerning Antiochus Epiphanes don't hold a light to what's going to be in the future. And then I wanted to say this. When we study Bible prophecy, we don't need to get so caught up in trying to learn all the details of the events that's going to take place that we miss the important part. And the important part of studying Bible prophecy is this. We need to see that God is the one who brings these things to pass. God is in control. God has a plan for every person and for every nation, and especially for his chosen people, the people of Israel. God is a just God. He'll judge the rebellious and he'll bless the righteous. And not only that, but another thing we need to realize is that you and I, we need to prepare ourselves for the return of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. He's coming back, and we need to make ourselves ready for his return. May God richly bless you today, and I just pray and hope that you've got something out of this lesson. I pray that in future lessons you'll be blessed. And I hope it won't be many lessons before I'll see you in church on Sunday morning. May God richly bless you. I love you.